All right, Jens, welcome back to Horror Joy. We are here today with the first installment of Meet Your Maker. This will be a series within the podcast where we talk with horror creators to get their perspective on, of course, horror and joy, but to really shine a light on the great work that they're doing to build community through horror and to really just foster that joy that Brian and I find in doing this work and reading the work of others and in making the connections like we've talked about throughout the podcast so far. So today with us, we have Jake Try, author of Nightmare Soup, which was a Kickstarter crowdfunded project that is very much an homage to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. First off, it's awesome. The artwork is fantastic. The stories are fantastic. It catches that great feeling of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. It took me back. We've already done an episode on Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. So listeners, you can go back and have a listen to that if you want to get our thoughts on that in particular. But I guess, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we can start asking Jake these questions about horror, joy, the inspiration for Nightmare Soup, the response to it, and the like. So, Brian.
Yeah, Jake, I'm so excited to have you on. This is an incredible book. You were willing to share with me at least the ultimate feast. And if you are listening to this and you have this affinity for these kind of horror stories, short horror stories, get that one. It's incredible. It is worth it to have the most amount of stories you can get out of this volume. Jake, we're excited to hear what you have to say about Nightmare Soup, about horror, about writing, about all this stuff, why you're doing it, what's going on. But first of all, of course, we are talking about joy and horror together. For a lot of people that we've talked to, this is a combination that makes a lot of sense. Does it make sense to you? What do you think about the relationship between joy and horror?
Absolutely. Well, first off, guys, thanks for having me on. Pleasure to come on here and talk to you guys about all creepy and crazy stuff and Nightmare Soup and the startings and beginnings of all that. But as far as horror and joy goes, I thought that was an interesting question and kind of an interesting theme that you guys kind of have put together here. And so I thought about that for a while. What does horror and joy, because a lot of people don't really put those two together, but there's a reasoning why you have to ask yourself, why is horror media, why is it so popular? I would almost argue that it's at a time when it's almost at its most popular right now. I think, you have the 80s and, 90s and stuff like that. But I think right now it's really seeing a resurgence. And I guess the answer I would come up with that is that, we spend our day-to-day lives clean. We do so much to try and make things safe. Everyone gets into their schedule, their day-to-day goings and forwards. And I think that we crave a little excitement, maybe a little mystery, a little darkness. We're so sanitized in our day-to-day life almost. I think that people are just looking for that little spark. And you don't just see that just in horror, it's in fantasy and thrillers and every type of stories there are out there. But I think horror in particular allows you to up the ante a little bit. And people at the end of the day, they like to be creeped out and scared a little bit. It's just because, in your day-to-day life, you really don't have that, hopefully. So I just think it gives people something interesting to read or watch. And at the end of the day, it's just cool. You're dealing with phenomena that don't happen. You're dealing with creatures and lore and monsters and stories. And I just think it's something that people enjoy and they're going to continue to enjoy. If you look at box office numbers for movies and stuff like that, horror is doing better than it ever has. Even the movies that are only costing a couple $1 million, they're low budget ones, even less than that, are having monster returns. I just think it's something that people like and they enjoy. It's like an amusement park, but a much darker amusement park.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that you hit so many things on the head right there. I like the kind of the contrast to the safety sanitized. There's a little bit of danger, a little bit of something in your life that allows for maybe a little excitement. But we've talked about this a lot. Jeff, you've mentioned this quite a bit, the idea that there's a kind of safety net to it that totally makes sense. I want to jump in. So you mentioned all these box office kind of hits and horror right now. There's a lot of nostalgia out there. We're getting Final Destination,
right?
A new Final Destination out. New I Know What You Did Last Summer. We've got the Scream franchise, right? That's churning. There's a lot going on in horror that seems to be kind of a throwback. You're doing a lot of that here with Nightmare Soup. It feels as though this is a kind of callback to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
Right.
Could you talk to us about that, how you got some inspiration from that series and what you're doing with Nightmare Soup?
Right. So first off, I'm going to talk about really what you said with the nostalgia. I don't know how old you guys are. I am 39. So I'm right in the thick of that like millennial type thing. And we're in the thick of our adulthood, right? So, we're getting to the point where, maybe some of us have a little bit of money, this and that. And we're starting to look back fondly, especially on like the time period of what we grew up, the 90s and things like that. And I think every generation does that to some extent. You look back on when you grew up and you have this positive affinity for it. And I think that's what's happening with us. So you're going to see a lot of media kind of try and cash in on that. I Know What You Did Last Summer is coming back, Screams, Final Destinations, why Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is still a thing. The Scary Stories books continue to be popular. So nostalgia is not going to stop anytime soon. Leading into that is kind of what got me and Andy Ciazco is the illustrator, into that. If you look at his illustrations of Nightmare Soup, they are very similar and reminiscent to Stephen Gammell. I would argue, and he'd say the same thing, that is his number one influence in terms of why he got started drawing and illustrating and kind of looking at his illustrations and using that as template for his going forward. Now, his art, different. He has his own little style, but it's very clear that he's been looking back and using Stephen Gammell is that template again. Nightmare Soup actually started in 2016. My primary job is digital advertising for different companies. And I was just looking around. I was like, I'm looking for some good designers and things like that. And I ran across Andy and I ran across some of his work. And it instantly made me think of Stephen Gammell. It just so happens that Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, Stephen Gammell, those were my favorite books growing up. Eagle Elementary, Brownsburg, Indiana. I can tell you where those books are in the school library to this day. It's like third row from the left and the front. All of us would fight over who gets to go in there and check them out. And I mean, they were like currency almost. Another interesting thing to think about that is that they're a lot older than actually people think. The first one was published in 1981. And I think the last one, the third one, was maybe 91, 92. It's interesting that they had just come about and become popular like when I was that age group. So I remembered those books and I remembered how popular they were. And I just thought to myself, man, it's been 30, 40 years since something like this has come out. I feel like I'm a decent writer. If me and him team up on this, we might be able to do something interesting. And it really did start off as like, we're going to be like a, Scary Stories 4, not an official thing, but just like an homage to it, something that people look at and be like, hey, this reminds me of that. And so we started off and the response to it was great. I mean, like I said, 2016, the stories were a little bit different. And then we've been doing that as we can up to this newest project with the Ultimate Feast. And it's kind of taken off. There's a podcast about it that a company did. Actually, it was the same company that distributed Terrifier 3, Bloody Disgusting, and their parent company, Cineverse, did a podcast. And it's just kind of, like I said, taking off a life on its own, and we're trying to see where we can take it.
That's awesome. Brian and I are both very much geriatric millennials as well. So, I mean, when you're talking about like where the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, where they were in the library, one of the things that we talk about when we start talking nostalgia and horror is like Scholastic book fairs. Like I remember these being available at Scholastic book fairs. Also, if Scholastic is listening, we're still looking for a sponsor. So that's an option for us out there. Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to hold up my copy of Nightmare Soup here. Like this thing's awesome. Like it reminds me of it. It does take me back to that. It has the spirit of those original stories. So I really appreciate that. And I wonder for you, like as a young person reading these stories, how did these stories, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, how did they like shape you as a reader, shape you as a horror fan? Obviously it's something that means a lot to you, given that you came back and came around and did a project like this. Right. But I wonder if you might just be able to talk about that for a little bit for us.
So I could talk for literally hours upon hours about Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. One thing that a lot of people may not realize is that a lot of these stories were folk tales. Alvin Schwartz, I couldn't tell you the percentage of how many were directly originals, but I know a very large percentage of them are old time, redone like folktale stories. And I think everybody kind of has an affinity for, fairy tales and folklore and things like that. In fact, the original Grimm's fairy tales are actually very dark. They had to redo those, for later audiences, but they started out as horror stories. And I think it almost harkens back to that and why those stories are so popular. And then you take that, how good they are as folklore, fairy tales, dark fairy tales, and then you add in this original type of dark illustration from Stephen Gammell. And let's be honest, the illustrations are what the books are known for, essentially. When people look back on it, they think back of a few stories like Harold and that creepy scarecrow, but the number one thing they remember is the illustrations. And I've thought a lot about why that is. And I think he tapped into something that was kind of organic in a way. When you look at it, it's like this disgustingly dark, stringy tendrils everywhere, organic looking thing, almost in the same way in which The Thing, like the 1982 Thing, like monster, like disgusts you. It's almost that way on a page. At the same time, these were children's stories. So as a kid, you're 9, 8 years old and you're seeing this thing and it's like terrifying to your eyes. You're like, am I supposed to be reading this? Is this something that like I'm supposed to have? Which again goes back to the fact that Scary Stories was a banned book. And I would argue, this might be a bit of heresy to say, but the stories were fairly tame if you go back and read the stories. There's none of them that are like hardcore or something that you would be like, oh, this is too much for a 7 or 8 year old. But I really think it's the illustrations combined with the stories that some parents were like, this is just too much. And I think that together is what really made it stand out so much. And I think that's what everyone remembers it for. And so, like I said, with Nightmare Soup, we were just trying to reproduce even just like, a tenth of that, because I have not yet seen something like that originally come about on its own in quite a while.
Yeah, that's really good. I think all of what you're saying rings true in terms of the illustrations being such a memorable part of that series. And like you're saying, it added such a creepy texture. You're reading it and it's like, this is creepy, especially as a young reader, but the texture and the world of the illustrations really hits. And I'm curious, I think, about your stories here in Nightmare Soup. Scary Stories seems to be oriented maybe towards a kind of younger audience. I know my daughter, 6th grade, they read some of these this year. It's still out there. People are still loving it. Did you intend this for a younger audience? And I'm even thinking like reading the first story, I Hate Clowns. It's got some bite. The ending is like, whoa, okay, I like this. This is good. Is it kind of intended for that younger audience? Just as a secondary question, we can come back to this. Like, part of me reading this was like, this is very Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. That's one. But two, it hit me right in the goosebumps also, because like the guy Max goes to Chuckles and Cheese, and it felt like I was right back, watching the animatronics and all that stuff. And so we talked about Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark really hitting some anxieties of youth, and even looking back now as an adult, like, oh, those are some things that I'm scared of. And even like your stories, I think, like the noodles, like what am I eating? You like look at noodles and you're like, what's going on? What if this were really worms? It just kind of gets to these like anxieties as a kid that you don't really know how to articulate, but later on you kind of work through them through this horror stuff, and it starts to make sense. So back to the original question: is the intended audience like as young as Scary Stories? Of course, up to whoever, right? Anybody can read these, but was it intended to be at least able to be read by that kind of younger audience?
Well, one thing I do want to say real quick is, isn't it kind of hilarious how we all collectively agree as a generation that when I grew up, it was Showtime, and then it was Chuck E. Cheese, like how terrifying those animatronics were. Because think about how much media there is out there of just those creepy like bots just sitting up there, just like, janking around and then going behind the big curtain and just being dead silent. It's hilarious that was a thing. But
we had something called Rocky and Bullwinkle, and there was these animatronic Rocky and Bullwinkle. Terrifying to this day. Terrifying.
You guys didn't have the original Showtime with the man. I wish I could remember. There was actually a name for the band. There's documentaries on it.
I remember Showtime.
All sorts of stuff.
I remember Showtime.
But yeah, going back to your question, we did originally, like I said, we wanted to do like almost in the beginning Scary Stories for almost like, obviously we knew it wouldn't be an official thing or anything like that. But so it was intended for like a younger audience, younger kids. And then kind of as we've gone through, I've just noticed myself getting like darker and darker and darker. And so I would say now, and you can kind of notice that if you, so the Ultimate Feast is like a collection of 3 different books, right? And if you read through it from the first to the end, you'll notice that they start to get like darker and darker and darker. So I'd say now it's probably like tween to teenager to maybe even young adult. We kind of stay away from any like hardcore adult themes, or I try not to use language in any of the stories. Just kind of keep it, strictly horror. And I also, honestly, I like to introduce just a little bit of lighthearted, like into it, lighthearted comedy sometimes into it. In that case, it is kind of, towards a younger audience. And you mentioned Goosebumps. That is another huge, huge influence on these. R.L. Stine and all the media that came from that. And then interestingly, all the other like knockoff, if that's what you want to call them, other books. There was the Fear Street was also R.L. Stine, but there was like the Bruce Coville books. There was, there was Spine Tinglers and so many different things. All that stuff. Animorphs even could be seen as is almost a derivative of that. All those stuff, I would say, influences what we've done in some way, shape, or form. It's not all serious stories to tell in the dark, even though that's the main one. But like I said, I think the goal was just to write something that was not too heavy. It's not going to be something that you read and be like, oh my gosh, this is going to sit with me for hours upon hours, like, some adult heavy novels are or anything like that, but just an enjoyable, almost folklore fairy tale-esque that's on the dark side, has a little bit of dark comedy to it. And then just overall, just is an enjoyable, fun read that doesn't take itself too seriously and has some really great art from Andy that gives that with the ultimate goal of being something new for a younger audience, and then for an older audience, for anybody that is a little bit older, checking them out, it gives you that nostalgic feel. So that's kind of what we attempted. I feel like we did an okay job, and so we're just going to keep rolling with it and see how many of these we can pump out.
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job. And again, maybe they're intended for younger audiences, but they've got some bite. So even if it's not nostalgic, you just like horror stories, this is really good.
Like I said, if you read some of the later ones, sometimes I was like, this is on the line, but oh well. If it gives a few kids nightmares, that's okay. They'll be all right. I survived. They'll survive.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably worse things on the news they can see at this point than what's in this book, honestly. So, yeah, Showbiz. Showbiz was the name of the old, like, Chuck E. Cheese. Yeah,
Showbiz.
I was like, I was looking up. Yeah, there's so much based on that. Like Five Nights at Freddy's, the Nicolas Cage one that's a knockoff of Five Nights at Freddy's. I'm blanking on the name of it, but
I saw it, yeah.
There's something just about dolls in general that I find kind of creepy, whether it's like Annabelle or the animatronics dolls or any automaton type. I mean, there's the movie that just came out, Companion, and then that might be a spoiler, so sorry listeners if that's a spoiler for you. You don't know that right away, but you should know that right away. And then what was the one, Megan, where she's like a Furby but kind of. Furby's also creepy. Like, do you have any? I'm just kidding. Do you have any Furby stories in your future? No,
there actually is a Furby story in Nightmare Soup.
Yes. Okay. Awesome.
Yes.
Good. Yeah. I'm excited to come upon that one. I have the Ultimate Feast. I've made it through the first book, so I'm looking forward to reading the next 2. Is there a favorite story of the ones in here so far?
Favorite story? So I have a lot of them that I like. There's a lot of one that we just came out with an additional book. I don't know if you guys got that one too, but Bloody Bites. It's kind of, again, we're moving into darker things. So there's a few good ones in that. One of my favorite ones is actually called, I like Full Moon Guess, because I thought that I had a good little twist there at the end. I don't know if I want to like tell what the twist is, but you think that it starts out as just this generic like slashers at a cabin thing, and then it's kind of got a little twist at the end for you. I'm sure I'm not the first person that's thought of that twist, but I thought it was all right. And then I'm blanking on the name of it, but there is one that is, I had a very Sandlot-esque growing up. My neighborhood was on a cul-de-sac with like 10 or 12 kids where we'd run around. We literally had an old train tracks and a junkyard like behind the neighborhood. Like it was about as Sandlot and like, in that way as you could possibly get. And there's a story about these kids who knock a baseball over the fence and they don't want to get it, much like the Sandlot. And trying to get over there and not be seen by the old, crotchety neighbor. And then I'll just go ahead and tell the twist on this one. But it ends up being that the old crotchety neighbor died many days ago, and the old woman just stuffed him and put him out like a scarecrow almost to keep kids from going into her yard. So that was one of my favorite ones. Let's see, we're getting to the point to where there's tons of them, so it's hard to think about, like I said, which one's my favorite one. I do like the first one, clown. I'm not a big clown guy in terms of like, I like them as scary things, but in terms of like liking them in real life, not. I do have a slight clown fear, I guess. So I hate clowns is up there.
Do people actually like clowns? This is always a question.
I feel like some people do, like in a carnival setting. I don't know. That's a very good question. Does anyone legitimately like clowns?
So we were trying to buy a house, and we were looking at a house. It was, we had a realtor or whatever take us through, and I kid you not, we went through this house, and all of the family pictures, they were all dressed up in clowns. Like they were clowns. Yeah. I don't know. I don't think we could buy that house.
Yeah, I would have some questions. I would have some questions on that one.
That's for sure. Like I'm with you, Jeff. I think I always ask like, what is the deal with clowns actually? If they're not just scary things, what are we doing with it? I don't understand clowns, but I'm sure there's somebody out there who want to tell us that we should rethink our clown stance.
Oh, I'm sure there's a whole segment of like, clown history and all that stuff of who knows.
I'll geek out for a second. My guess is it probably comes out of the Commedia dell'arte, which is an Italian form in the Renaissance, like where you have these clowns that are meant to be comic relief, amusing. It's kind of how clowns function in rodeos. That's kind of how they function in the circus even. I don't know. Growing up, we had a neighbor who was a clown for like the local shrine that did circuses and stuff, and he did balloon animals and stuff too, and he was a great guy. But the clown thing, I don't know, like I was just always like, nope, I'm scared and terrified, and I don't care how many balloon animals you can make. That seems like devil magic. I don't get it. It's weird,
right?
But the clown story in here, fantastic. I love it. So I guess, Jake, like you said, you do advertising, like that's like your day job. Yeah. Has Nightmare Soup taken on a life of its own to this point yet, where it becomes like the full-time job, or is it at this point still like just a labor of love?
So right now, and I've experienced this a couple of times when doing transitioning, it's almost there to where it could be its own thing, but I just want to smoothly transition to it, so I'm not like working a million hours a day, which I already feel like I am. We are very close to making it a full-time thing. The actual big deal is we are going to try a movie. So we have those connections with Cineverse and the Bloody Disgusting people. And I have a very good production crew here in Indianapolis with all the big boy toys. They have the Arri cameras and all those big time things. And we've worked together on a few things in the past, so know what they're doing. And we have, over the years, like I said, doing this type of thing, you just kind of meet people and make connections. And we feel like at this point, it's something that we can take a shot at. So it's going to be, we're attempting, it's going to be an old school anthology where there's going to be, it'll have its primary driver story that essentially introduces all the other stories, just kind of like Creepshow and Tales from the Dark Side and all that stuff. So we are in the beginning processes of that. We've done like a little teaser that is not complete yet, but I'm working on it. So that is the next big thing. And then there's a couple other books that I'm working on that will come out at the same time. So we're hoping for one big glob of one big, helping, so to speak, of Nightmare Soup to kind of push us into full-time creepy stuff. And that would be much welcomed. I'm looking forward to going into all in on the creative stuff because I've been looking to do that for quite some time.
Well, that's awesome. Grab the biggest Ladle you can. Get all that Nightmare Soup as much as you can. I'm curious about, like, you kind of jumped into this with Andy Siasko, the artist, doing the sketches and the art. Did you write horror before this? Do you have other horror stuff that's out there that's published, or is this the first kind of foray into horror writing?
I wrote a lot in college, and I wouldn't say it was really horror related. It was a lot of sci-fi. It's almost one of those questions. Do you consider Alien a horror movie? Do you consider The Thing a horror movie? It can go either way, really. So I like sci-fi a lot, but that was my first foray into like quote unquote strictly scary stories, I guess, even though, they were more towards kids. I'm finding myself that I do like that dark comedy almost. I like that lighthearted horror that is becoming popular right now. And like I said, I also like a lot of the folklore horror type stuff. I've been doing this for 10 years. So in the start, the stories were probably not that great. I did rewrite them all over, but I feel like, I've kind of got a grasp on it now. And that's something I really enjoy doing. So there's going to be a lot more stories coming from me as long as I can do it. And like I said, hopefully this movie thing goes well and we can get into that area because, I love my horror movies as well. That is something I always have been a fan of. I especially love the cheesy 80s horror movies. I think those are the best. Practical effects are, you can't match those with CGI. So everything is hopefully trending in that direction. So we'll just have to see.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really hope that comes to fruition. When you were talking about like those old anthology shows from like the 80s and 90s, it had me thinking about the comic series that's out through Boom right now, Epitaphs from the Abyss, and how we see like a lot of the short form horror coming out, which I guess Nightmare Soup in its way is short form horror, like with the individual stories that then fit into a larger whole. So I think we're both super stoked to see that. Hopefully that does happen. And if it does, maybe we'll get to have you back on to talk
Absolutely.
about it. We would love that. But I guess before we wrap up here, I guess where can we find, or where can folks find Nightmare Soup? Where's the best place for them to get it? I know there's a website. Is it in bookstores currently, or is it only available through the website?
So we keep it pretty strict. Just you do have to look at it from a business standpoint as well, as far as like manufacturing, things like that. So we like to have most control over that. So right now they are primarily available at nightmaresoup.com, and we work with a production house that someone ships them and all that stuff. Also, if you're more of like an audio person, again, Cineverse and Bloody FM did a podcast. They have a little different take on it. I kind of gave them some creative control, but in terms of like the outside story, but the internal stories are pretty much all the same. They did a fantastic job with the voice acting and all that stuff. So you can look up the Nightmare Soup podcast. I believe that is on Apple and Spotify and pretty much anywhere that podcasts can be found. And again, we're probably going to do another Kickstarter for another series of books. So that will be coming up in the near future. So a lot of Nightmare Soup projects coming out. And again, we're going to do, like I said, the movie. So we're going to have that. That's going to be funded in about 3 ways. We're going to do the crowdfunding. We have investors for it. And then, like I said, we'll have our own personal funding for it. So a lot of different ways to eat your soup, so to speak. If you're strictly interested in the books right now, like I said, nightmaresoup.com. I did want to say, I don't know why I got caught off guard with my favorite story part. You'd think that's like the number one thing I would know. Pretty Pumpkins is probably my favorite story. It is a story from the first one about these kids. I'm a big fan of like the Stranger Things aesthetic and, kids running around getting into mischief. And like I said, that's kind of how I grew up. And that story has a little bit of everything of what I like in horror story and sci-fi and strange things. So check that one out. And yeah, so that's where we stand on things, Nightmare Soup.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that story. That's a really good one.
Well, mentioning all the kind of horror films and stuff that you like, the 80s stuff, and your own project, curious, of course, if there's anything recently you've come across that you've read, watched, played, anything like that that's generated joy for you, especially in that relationship between joy and horror. Any horror stuff that's caused you joy?
I ran across a movie. Sometimes, when I'm busy or I just need some background music or whatever, background sound, I'll just kind of put on something random from Amazon or Amazon Prime or Netflix, whatever. And I ran across one on Amazon, I think it was, that caught my attention. So I had to go sit down and watch it. It was called Dark Harvest. It wasn't a mainstream movie. I wouldn't say it was a low budget movie either. It was kind of one of those mid tiers, but the story was just so incredibly different. It had a bunch of things that I like. It was a period piece. It's like set in the 1950s in this town in the middle of nowhere. And I'll try not to give away a whole lot here, but each year this creature comes alive from the cornfields, and the boys of the town have to find it and hunt it down and kill it on Halloween and eat the candy that comes out of its stomach. I know that sounds super weird. And they must do this before this monster gets to the church, because if it gets to the church in the center of town, like these dust storms will overtake the entire town and screw up life for everybody. And I won't reveal anymore, but it's just so different. And I thought it's practical effects, and I thought the monster design was awesome. I thought just the story and how weird it was kind of really piqued my interest. And so yeah, Dark Harvest, go check that out if you get a chance.
Yeah, I love that. I have not watched that movie yet, but I read the book by Norman Partridge.
I did find out that it was a book.
Yeah, the book was really fun, really fun. I will say that I loved reading Nightmare Soup. I have not read all of them. There's a lot more to go, and I am very thankful for that. So thank you for all the stories that you've put out there. I'm very excited to read them. They're incredible, folks. If you are listening and you have not heard about Nightmare Soup, if you love good short stories, this is one for you, especially if you love that nostalgic stuff, Goosebumps, especially Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. This really hits it. So if you have that itch, this is the one. Go grab a copy, whatever copy you can get. And it's exciting to hear that so much is coming out from you and from Andy. This is incredible project, and we are going to be looking out for more stuff. Jeff, any final thoughts? Any other questions for Jake?
No, just say I've also seen the movie Dark Harvest 2023. It's excellent. Can't recommend it enough. So Jake, glad to hear someone else has found these weird, not quite B, not quite A horror movies on Prime to watch at times. But yeah, echoing Brian, Nightmare Soup's awesome. Please send our thanks, congratulations, gratitude along to Andy as well. We really look forward to what comes next and can't wait to be scared along with everybody else.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for having me on. It was a blast talking to you.
This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.